This story, this mystic story, is for Onyxe Antara. She claimed a story on Facebook, and I've chosen a rock for her. This is a nice piece of cloudy quartz. It has kind of a buttery white color to it, and it has some light brown goldish speckles in it. Reminds me of a dark honey. And Onyx chose yellow, the number 5. She wants to bring in clarity of thought, and she wants to release grief. So Onyx, you give me a moment, and this story is for you. Once there was a gigantic quartz pyramidal-shaped structure in the town of Wainscott. Now, I'm not sure where Wainscott was, but they were famous for this quartz pyramid. It had been built and engineered beautifully. All of the stones were cut perfectly, just as if they were planning for an Egyptian pyramid. But it wasn't really a pyramid shape like we're used to, the 4 sides and the equal sides. It was a long, tall obelisk that shot up to the sky. And it was just this color of quartz, and it had these little golden specks of honey throughout it. And some people like to make up stories about what this obelisk was for and what it was about. The founding fathers didn't really know. They had built it because they wanted to be known for something. They wanted Wainscott to be known throughout the world for their gorgeous 100-foot-tall obelisk. It pointed up to the yellow sun, and when the sun shone on it, the obelisk looked almost as golden yellow as the sun. It seemed to absorb that beautiful, beautiful color. And around the obelisk, it had 5 stations. 5 stations that people could sit at and take pictures and watch it and meditate. And it became a place of meditation and a place of joy for Wainscott. People came from all over the world to see it. And the people of Wainscott were proud. They were really, really proud of their obelisk. Some thought that it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Some thought it was an eyesore. You know how people are. Even beauty can be seen in a negative way. Some didn't really know what they thought about it, and they were confused. They didn't know whether to believe the people who spoke against it or the people who raved about it and said that they went to sit and meditate under it every day. They heard people claim that they could hear the angels as they sat and meditated under the obelisk. But there was one woman who was especially fond of it. She would go every single morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. And she felt that they had put those 5 stations there just for her. And at each place, they had built a wonderful stone bench that matched the obelisk. The same cloudy, honey-flecked quartz. Each bench looked just like the obelisk in color and form. So each day, she would sit at a different station. And she seemed to see that each time she sat at one place, she would meditate about joy and ask to bring joy into her life. At another, she would ask for clarity and ask for clarity of thought to be brought into her life. At another, she would ask for her grief to be released, and so on. And she used that square in the town. She used it day after day after day. It was her favorite place in the world. One day, Mary was her name, went on vacation. She decided she would have to go and buy herself a little piece of smoky quartz crystal with honey flakes in it, just like the obelisk, so that she would feel like she had it with her and she could meditate when she held on to the rock. So she went to her favorite gemstone store in town, in Wainscott, and she told the proprietress, I want a stone just like the obelisk. And the proprietress says, I have the very same thing. I have a very tiny miniature obelisk that's made out of the same material that they made the real obelisk out of. Well, you know, that was kind of a touristy thing. But Mary really didn't care. She wanted to take it with her, so she paid a pretty price for it. And she took it with her the next day, which would be her last day before she went on her vacation. And she sat at each station. She sat at the station for joy for a long time. She sat at the station for clarity of thought for even longer, because that's what she needed the most. And she pined over that because there were so many things in her life that she was doubtful over. And she sat at the station for grief even longer, because not only did she have no clarity on many things, she was grieving over many things. And so on. Each of the 5 stations, she held her miniature obelisk and put all the energy of that place and her thought into it to take with her. And she knew that it would be okay. And people were allowed to touch the obelisk. So she went up and held her hand on it, and she held the stone, and she imagined the energy flowing through it, through her, into her stone, and she was overjoyed. And she left on vacation happier than she'd ever been in her whole life. She went far and wide. She went to Africa. She had a speaking engagement that she went all over Europe. And she was in the farthest reaches of northern Sweden when she heard a news report. And she was devastated. There had been a horrible, horrible tornado near Wainscott with 150-mile-an-hour winds. And the one main structure that it had torn down and obliterated into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces was her obelisk. She had begun to think of it as hers because it was so close to her heart. Mary cried for days, absolute days, without stop. She didn't think that she was ever going to quit crying. She didn't really know how she got through the rest of her tour, but she held that obelisk every moment that she could. And she kept it close to her body wherever she went when she couldn't have it in her hand. She came home to see the mass destruction that was there. All the stones had been swept up into a pile. And they were coming with bulldozers and scraping them up into those huge, massive buckets and dumping them into dump trucks. Her heart was broken. She sat at the station of grief. And oddly enough, the wind had not touched any of the stations in her meditation circle that she used to go to every day. She picked up one of the pieces and kept it. And she meditated for the longest time she had ever done so. And she left there with a heavy heart still. And she kept that on her heart and her mind for weeks. And she would go back sometimes 3 times a day to do every station again. As she continued doing this, her load started to lighten. It started to lift from her heart. She didn't know why at first. And suddenly, one morning, when the sun was absolutely brilliant, she woke up with a start and had this immense desire to run outside, and she did. And the whole sky was full of sunshine. She looked up and just smiled into the sunshine. And she could see her obelisk before the destruction, and it touched her heart. And she had grabbed her piece of stone and she had it in her hand. And all of a sudden, in her heart, she knew that she had not lost the obelisk, that it would always be with her, that the wisdom of the ages and the wisdom of the spirit of it would always be with her. And she had her peace. And she had her miniature obelisk that she had put the energy into from the real one. And from then on, she really didn't need always to go to the 5 stations. Sometimes she would just hold the rock, and it held that energy, and it cleared her thoughts. She was able to make decisions. She was able to process her grief, and it was because she had passed through that horrendous grief. It was a grief that she never thought she could ever endure, but it was a grief that had cleansed her and had made her mind and her body and her heart and her soul know who she was and what she was to do.